So, of course, I'd like to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're discussing managing revisions, states, and permissions in Onshape. So, we're going to focus not so much on the CAD aspects of Onshape, but all the data management related things we talk about when we discuss really using Onshape in a day-to-day company. So, managing revisions, states, and permissions. As I always say with these webinars, I really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions dialog, and you go to Webinar Control Panel. Feel free to ask any question, and I'll do my best to stop and address the questions from time to time. So let's dig into it. Now, there are always a few things that I want to discuss, but just briefly, an agenda before we get started. First off, I want to discuss common workflows. Now, I know this is one of those things that's very much relevant to your company, your business, and every company or business has their own variation of how they like to see these workflows in what they do day to day. But I'm going to discuss a few common workflows of things that I think are pretty similar between companies, not necessarily the same, but very close. And then also discuss how Onshape can fit into these types of workflows. So we're going to discuss states, revisions, permissions, and of course teams. And I think the combination of those things can really give you that workflow-like behavior that you may be used to. And if you're not familiar with it, what I mean by that is just the various progression of a CAD model, from its creation to the review process to the release cycle, even things like an obsolete cycle for designs that are out of date. So just keep in mind, we're going to discuss a lot of the more data management aspects and not as much Onshape CAD, so to speak. Okay, so, and of course I want to show you a simple example, as I always do. How would you go about accomplishing these things? Where can I find some of these things in the Onshape interface? Question: when you use a version of a part in multiple unrelated assemblies, are they treated as separate parts, or does changing the part in other assemblies? They are treated as one part, so to speak. So if you make a change to one part and you've inserted it using an insert dialog where you browse, it will update. And if it's in a different document, it will update when you create a new version. But just keep in mind, when you change that one part, if it's used in several different places, if you create a new version, it will, you can choose to update it. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the first thing I wanted to get into is just a common workflow. And I know that a lot of companies out there, this is something that's very much specific to what they do. So, I by no means expect your company to fit, cleanly within this workflow, but I think a lot of companies share these steps in the process. And so if you think about CAD as a process from start to finish, you have your starting point where you start your design, and oftentimes referred to as in progress, or there's lots of names for each one of these states within the workflow. But the idea behind it is this is where you get a lot of the work done. Right? This is where you do the initial design. 90% of the time is going to be spent in this first state. And that's where the work is done. Then you have some kind of review process. And oftentimes I have to submit it to a manager or to, some client, maybe for example, and I need them to sign off, so to speak, on the design. And that review process is oftentimes referred to as pending or pending release or something to that effect. In Onshape, we have the state of pending. So it goes from a start where you do all the design work. The state changes the design to pending, which is pending someone's review. Then it gets passed, once it's finally approved, into obsolete. Now, of course, you could say that, what if I don't want to approve it, right? Then it would go back to in progress. And we can again get into the complexities of the workflow. There are companies out there with dozens of states in their particular workflow, but just kind of keeping it simple, once it's approved, it goes to released. And for a lot of companies out there, that would mean it's now revision A, or whatever your revision scheme might be. But the idea behind it is you cannot change it, right? This is a milestone in the design. It's a version that's been captured, and it's not going to change. Now, we may have an ECO at some point in the future, right? We may have a change that needs to happen to revision A, but for the moment, it's view only, and it can't be changed. Now, there's also another stage in here of what we refer to as obsolete, and of course, obsolete just means outdated, no longer used. It's an easy way to tag a document saying, don't touch. It's no longer relevant. And again, workflows vary company to company, but I think a lot of them share these particular states. What I'd like to do today is kind of walk you through how we might manage something like this. And I'd like to do this kind of from the perspective of a CAD admin, where I'm the administrator of my company. When new projects come in, I create the documents, I manage permissions of the documents, I manage these things so that everybody understands the status. So this is a typical example. Again, start, review, released, obsolete. And of course, in that process, you have some kind of change order typically happening for new revisions. How would I accomplish this in Onshape? And this is what I want to get into, specifically states, revisions, and permissions more specifically. So remember, within a company, you can have teams. So when I create a new document as a CAD admin, let's say that I've got a new project coming in. I create a new document. The document is owned by the company and initially isn't shared with anyone. But what I can do is create a document and then share it with specific teams, sometimes referred to as groups in other systems, and share it with those teams and give them their permissions to the document. So it's a process of assigning the ownership to the company and then giving permission to the appropriate people within my company. And that could be in the form of one big team, or it could be individual users. It's entirely up to you. The neat thing about this is they do the design work, then they submit a review. The first thing I'm going to do as a CAD admin is then go back and change permissions to view only, right? So I'm changing the permissions to view only. No one can edit the design. If it gets approved, then it gets stamped with a revision, right? I go in and I create a revision. I change the state and I restrict the permissions. So again, just trying to walk you through the workflow. You're going to use states, revisions, of course, but you're also going to use things like teams and the share permissions to restrict access to the document depending on those things. So let's get into it. Now, real simple example. I'm not going to do a lot of CAD, so to speak, because of course we're talking more about the data management aspects of things. But one of the commonly asked questions, if I'm in a company, how do I make sure that a document is owned by the company? When you click create, you're going to see an owned by. And if you belong to a company, by default, it will give you that company as the default. So we can say this is my new project, right? So I created a new document. Now I, as the CAD admin, creating a new document. It's owned by my company, Midwest Machine Tech. I click OK, and I'm off and running. Right now, I can share this with the people that it needs to be shared with. Right, very easy to do in Onshape. I can click share, click teams, and define, okay, what teams do I want to give access to this project, and what kind of control do they need? Maybe at first it's just the machine design team, and they need edit, full edit permissions. I click share. The entire team is shared in at once. So you could have a dozen people, you could have one person, two people. It's entirely up to you. But the neat thing is you can share with multiple people at once. You can control the permissions of multiple people at once. And remember, you can change this. So maybe the machine design team's part in the project is done, but now you need to pass it off to another series of users and have them do their piece in the design. Remember, I can go in and change the permission. So I can say, okay, the machine design team is done. They get view only access, no comment. I can really fine control over who has access, and I hit update. And now all they can do is view, and maybe I can share with the industrial team. I give them edit permission. So now the industrial team has edit permission, the machine design team has view permission. But remember, it allows you to control things in very granular way. I can say this group of users only gets this access versus this group of users gets that access. So that's one important aspect of this, sharing with the team. So now I've created a document that's owned by the company, right? It's never going to disappear with a user as the user leaves. It's owned by the company, and it's shared with the teams that need it only with the permissions that they need. And that's an important part of this. So let's say, I've done the design work. I've created my project. We did all the design work, and the various teams working together in the same document have done their various pieces. Let's jump into a document here. And we're ready to start the revision, pending approval revision process, right? And I want to understand, who's going to have access to it. I want to know what revisions and what state the design is currently in. So one of the first things I might do as a CAD admin is restrict the access, right? Because we've reached a point where it's a milestone in the design. I'm going to go in, click share, and decide, no more edits. Everyone has view-only access, right? So can view. We'll update those permissions. Now everyone's locked out of the document. Now I can go in and decide, okay, what is the approval process? And I want to create a version to capture this, right? So I'm going to create a version. I'm going to say, let's call this revision B. Right, so this is revision B. An important step, an easy one to miss, but an important one, create version and edit properties. The state of a design can only be tweaked as associated with a version. You can't change the state of an active workspace. So the big thing I want to stress is you're setting that state as you're creating a version. So I click create version and edit properties, and then it takes me into the edit properties dialog. And you can see I've already got revisions of all the various parts within my top level assembly, but now I can go in and change the state. And I can change the state of individual ones independently, of each other. I'm not changing them all at once. So I can say that this is in progress, or this is all now pending, right? And so I'm controlling independently each one of these states, and then also controlling access to it based on my permissions, right? Now, another example I want to stress here is, let's say that maybe you have a manager or some person that does the approval process, or maybe it's a group of people. I could easily have a approval team, or a QA team, or a management team that once my design goes to pending, I then share with that particular group. So just keep in mind, I'm now setting the state of all these. I click done, and now I've established a revision and a state for my design at revision B, for example. Now, one thing I want to stress, and it's a commonly asked question, so let me jump back into my slide deck just briefly here. I do have a few frequently asked questions that I wanted to address. One of the first, and it's one of the more common ones, is, in this example, I want to be able to share revision A with a vendor, but not the latest. Very common question. I want to be able to share, the latest market design. I don't want to share what we're currently working on, the latest state of the model. And so it's a commonly asked question. I'm sharing it with vendor A or my machine shop or whomever it may be. How do I ensure that they're looking at revision A and not the latest? If I share with them, it assumes the latest. One big tip that I have for you, if I create a version, let's say, if I go into versions here, you can see revision B. This is the version we created just a moment ago. If I click on this, it's going to load revision B. The important thing I want to stress here is this URL can be sent to someone that's shared in on the document. So if you've shared a document with someone, you can send them this URL and they will load that version. So you can use this version, so to speak, as kind of the quote-unquote, standard. So a lot of users out there say, I want to be able to give them a drawing or give them a part and know that it's never going to change. That is a static version. This is a great way to do that. Another commonly asked question is, what if I wanted to import a part into my ERP system and I want to know that it's at revision A? A lot of times you can just take the link where you would otherwise import a file, take the link and use it as a reference. The important thing is this link, this version, will never change. All right, so this is a moment in time, it's a snapshot, and it's a useful way if you're trying to ensure that someone's looking at the right version and not necessarily the latest. So big tip, if you load a version, if you left click on a version in your versions manager, you can grab that URL and send it to someone that's already shared in the document, and they load that exact version. Right? All right, so a few questions. Any method to change all the states at once? This is actually a few questions I see in here. I do want to point out, though, that this is an area that we are going to be adding more functionality very soon in. So the ability to add more columns or more properties is something that's very, very high on our list of priorities. The ability to automate the state creation and things like that is very high on our list of priorities. So realize what I'm showing you here today could very well change in the future, maybe even in the near future. Now, the question, and I'm fairly certain the answer is going to be no. You cannot change the state of several at once. Now, forgive me, I'm going to come back to that and make sure that I'm not missing anything, but I think there is a limitation of one part at a time. Question, can we define multiple owners? You can change the owner. You cannot define multiple owners. Remember, a document is owned by a company and then shared with teams or individuals within the company. So in this example that I've given you, the company technically owns the document, not any one individual. And you can, by the way, change the owner. If you do a share and you enter someone's email address, you can define them as owner. That's how you change ownership of the document if you've never done it before. All right. How do you create a team? It's a very good question. And if you go into your manage account in the top right corner here, you've got teams. And you can click create team. And essentially what you get is the ability to create a team and then invite people to it. And again, it's just a neat way to share with a lot, control the permissions of a lot of users in a single shot. And I mentioned before also the concept of companies. You'll see your company information here as well. My company is Midwest Machine Tech, and you can see all the users that are in it. All right, so question, if I share a URL of a version with someone and ensures the right version opens, but it doesn't restrict them from changing to any other version of Workspace, it doesn't restrict them from changing it. You're correct. Now remember, your permissions can restrict them. I should clarify that. It doesn't restrict them from changing to the latest, going in themselves and switching to the latest version. But remember, with the permissions, they can't change anything, right? So oftentimes we'll tell users just, send them this link and tell them this is the reference that you're supposed to use. But you're right, it does not restrict the user from changing over to the latest if they decided to. Now remember, the permissions can restrict them from editing the model. That's an entirely different thing. But you're right, it doesn't control their ability to see the latest. Very important to set your permissions to view only if all they need is view only access. That's an important tip. All right, so what about sharing with other teams? You can share with any team that you've established. You do have to establish it beforehand, but you can share with any team that you'd like. What if a version is in pending state? Can you change it to released later or vice versa? And the answer is yes. So keep in mind, if I change this design to released and, an ECO happens and, 6 months later we have a new design, I'm then going to go back at some point and change revision B I created a moment ago. I'm going to change that to obsolete. So I'm going to change the state of a version I created months ago because now that design is obsolete, right? So a very good point. Can you change the state of a version later? Yes. And for that scenario, for the scenario of, revision B is now obsolete, we're on to revision C, you'll want to denote that. So very good question. Let's see here. Jumping back, so how do I share revision A with a vendor? Again, I would use the sharing with a link. Again, important to point out, a lot of what you're seeing here is going to evolve, hopefully evolve very soon. So keep in mind this is an area we're working very hard on. But these are things that our users are doing today to accomplish these things. Sharing a link is a good example. Now, a question that's already come up in our questions here is, can I currently create my own property or create my own state? And the answer is no, not yet. But that is, again, an area that we're working hard on. Now, what about notifications? This is something that I've seen asked quite often, and we don't have a way to trigger an automated notification based on the change of a state, for example. But what we do have is the ability to add comments in the document, and anyone tagged in that document will get a notification. So it is a solution that users are working on. Now, keep in mind, this is another area that will be evolving very soon, but this is something that, everything I've shown you here today is bare bones Onshape. This is not a separate PDM application. Everything I've given you here today, anyone can use. So just keep in mind, no special applications, and these things are going to be built into Onshape as well. All right, so I mentioned before the ability to set the design's permissions, set the state of the design. I do want to mention just briefly one last time that you can come back and change these. So if there is some situation where I, as the CAD admin, have received an ECO and I need to open up this document and allow it to be changed, I can always come back into the document and as an admin, as part of my company, I can say, well, let's change this permission to edit and let the machine design team work on this design again. So just realize again that just because I've reached that point, maybe in released state or even obsolete state, I can, as an admin, a part of my company, even though no one else has access to it, I can come in and change that permission. So it's really trying to give you that granular level of control. Remember, the company owns the document, but I, as the admin, can go in and control who has access to it at what times. All right, so that really is what I had planned for you. I am going to stick around and answer any questions that you'd like, including this one. How is the admin function specified and controlled? In the company, you would specify either a user or an admin. So there's going to be members and admins. You can see in this case I'm the owner. The owner of the company has its own role within the company, but then within that I can add a new user and define them as either admin or member. And that distinction, and a commonly asked question, is there a way to tie all this in to something like an ERP or PLM system that's commonly asked? The answer is yes. You can take something like a bill of materials that you've generated and export as CSV. That's what a commonly asked users. That's how they typically integrate it. But yeah, it's adding users, very simple. You would add new users here, define them as member or admin, and then you're off and running. And another commonly asked question, you can have more than one admin in your company if you choose to. So that's another commonly asked one. We don't want one person with the controls over, we want more than one. You can do that. You can have more than one admin within your company. And that's entirely up to you. All right, so a few questions. How does versioning work with other PLM systems? It seems like the URL link is the best way. Again, it depends on what you're pushing into the PLM system. A commonly asked, I want to be able to take the bill of materials and push it into an ERP or PLM system. And the way users are doing that today is oftentimes taking and generating a BOM with like OpenBOM or the bill of materials app that works with Google Sheets, generating a CSV and then bringing that into this. So if you're looking for bill of materials, that's a commonly asked workflow. Now, if you're just looking for, I want to store revision A in my ERP system so that anytime, some point in the future, someone could come back and click on it and find revision A. Yes, I think link is the best method for accomplishing that today. Using a link that I was showing you, the URL that I was showing you earlier. Question. You've created revision A of the document. How would you go about changing the gear, creating a new revision in the gear, and then viewing the released assembly? So the question, I believe, is how would I change a part within the assembly and then later release it? And it would be the workflow I would follow in this scenario is make the ECO change, send the state back to in progress. This is just my preference in this scenario. The key thing is you would need to do that for that part in the state, and then it would go back to in progress. The design would change. The assembly would automatically update course, everything's in the same document. That's the case if you store your documents that way. And then you would pass it back into the released state in the design. So, or excuse me, pending approval. Once that's done, the state would be changed back to released. In your example, really only changing the state of the gear within your assembly, but the workflow process would be the same, right? So the change in permissions, the controllers, the cadmin would be the same as what we just did, whether it's one part or multiple. Question, can this easily be integrated with PLM systems or even PDM system? What metadata is stored and how is it stored? Well, integration with PLM and ERP systems is kind of a topic to itself. We don't have a push-button type integration with an ERP or PLM system. If you're looking for click a button and it populates data in an ERP system, it's not. There's no application out there to do it today. A lot of users are communicating via CSVs if you're looking for bills of materials, or we have an open API if you're interested in creating something that passes metadata back and forth. But oftentimes it's users passing files back and forth between systems. And that's the communication method we've seen most commonly. Not ideal, of course, but it would take, and again, we do have an open API, so it is technically possible. It just takes the time to build that integration with each one. Question, what does ECO stand for? Engineering Change Order. There's ECN, there's all kinds of acronyms for it, so forgive me if you use a different one, but essentially it just means you have a release design, you decide you need a new revision, and that new revision is the engineering change order, and that process typically is what pushes it back into a state that a user or a team can edit it. Question, are states and permissions linkable? For example, in a certain state, we always want released files to be shared with certain groups automatically. It is not, you cannot automate the transfer of permissions based on the state yet. So I believe the short answer is going to be no. But I will say that is something that is very close on our radar. It's a very high on our list of priorities. So you would have to do it as 2 steps today manually, but that is something that we're hoping to do in the future. Can I push from a PLM system to Onshape controlling metadata and versioning? Technically, yes, but again, there's no push button integration. It would take custom APIs to accomplish this, but you could do it technically. Onshape has an API that will allow you to accomplish that. Can you specify on revisions during design stage? Say like prototype, first prototype, second. Can I specify? You can add descriptions. Forgive me if I'm misunderstanding your question. So if you want to specify first prototype, second prototype, and establish those as just notes to go along with the version, you can add that as a description. You can add the version can be any name that you'd like. So you can type in any name you want for a version. But you can also add a description with a version, and that's an easy way to capture little notes that you may have. First prototype, second prototype, or going to market, revision A, those types of things. Can a user email be assigned to more than one team? Can an email be assigned to more than one team? I'm not sure I totally understand. Forgive me. I'm not sure I follow. You can share a document with more than one team. Forgive me, I'm misunderstanding that question. If you want to use multiple versions of a part throughout different designs, do you make a copy to unrelate them? If you want to use multiple versions of a part throughout different designs, no, you don't have to do that. When you're inserting parts, there's a version graph button, and it will allow you to choose a version within the document. So you can choose versions within the document to insert. You don't have to choose the latest, and you don't have to copy either. Is there any control of workflows, such as approvals, checkers? No, there's not an automated way to control. So once a state does this, then you do that. There's no if-then statements that are tied to states as of today. So right now, if I had multiple groups with different permissions, and a state. Once I hit a state change, all those permissions need to change. I would need to change the state of the model and then go into each team and change the permissions for each team. So there is a two-step process. And as I mentioned before, and I've said it a few times now, this is something that that is currently being improved as we speak. This is something that we're actively working on. So the automation into this, right now, as I mentioned, you do need to set the permissions yourself, and you need to establish the state yourself. But all of those, that's two steps, and we will be boiling it down to one, hopefully very soon. Another good question: is there a where used? No, there's not a easy way to look through all the assemblies that are part, or even drawings for that matter. No. And I will say that, I know that OpenBOM has that bill of materials app that will allow you, or the OpenBOM app will allow you to accomplish that. But Onshape itself doesn't have a where used.